Hello, it's Cried here, with a simple but elegantly optimized build, the Ardent Angel. Actually, there's going to be two very different versions of this build for you to choose from. One of them fully utilizes a trick that the game doesn't tell you with the Ash of War aspects of the Crucible wings. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that this weapon art performs spinning slashes when done with a Twinblade, and a charge with everything else. The game literally tells you that. That's the kind of secret you find on bait videos. So let's examine this weapon art and see how it fares. While you might think that the special version of the Twinblade is bound to be stronger because it is, well, special, the simple truth is that it is not normally so. First up, the Twinblade version has a much longer cast time and cancel frames. This makes it more likely for you to get hit during the weapon art, and it leads to a lower DPS as well, since you can't cast as many of these in quick succession. While the Twinblade version of the weapon art looks impressive, with 460% damage in total, it does so by splitting the weapon art into 8 hits. This means that you have to pass through defense 8 times, even if you manage to land all 8 of your hits. So the actual damage is not nearly as high as it seems. And landing all 8 of your hits is much more difficult than landing just one hit from any of the other weapon types. Why is that the case? First up, since you deal damage through multiple swings of your Twinblade, some of your hits are done before diving at the enemy. So if you don't use this weapon art at a close range, you're definitely going to be missing a few hits. Take a look at my character's positioning right near the skull on the ground for this demonstration. While technically, the Twinblade version of the skill has roughly the same range, you aren't able to deal its maximum damage, unlike with other weapon types. Secondly, even if you do use your weapon art at a close range, you can very easily dive past enemies with the Twinblade version of Crucible wings. It is unrealistic to assume that you will be hitting all 8 hits most of the time. Be thankful you can consistently land 6 hits. Additionally, the Twinblade version of this skill also costs 30 more stamina than all the other versions. And what's worse is that you're also only doing 400% of the weapon's poise damage over 8 hits, instead of 400% in 1 hit. And if you remember what I said about missing 2 hits easily, it means that you're going to be doing less poise damage than other weapon types. Furthermore, since other weapon types have higher base poise while their animation time is shorter, the difference really shows. You can, in practice, double the amount of poise damage of the Twinblade version with the regular version in terms of stance damage per second. One more thing about the Twinblade version of the weapon art is that it deals slash damage. I'm mentioning this because the great way to utilize the normal version of the weapon art is to just slap on a physical infusion like Heavy and equip the Spear Talisman. Yep, you guessed it. The normal version of aspects of the Crucible wings does pierce damage, and it is fairly easy to get the counter damage punish timing, even by accident with this weapon art. Now, you might say, "Crite, it's unfair to compare the Twinblade to a colossal sword." While I'm mostly demonstrating this weapon art with a Greatsword, this colossal sword is indeed quite heavy. But don't worry, there is an excellent alternative on heavy infusion. The new sword lance has excellent scaling to strength while weighing much lighter, only a tad bit higher than Twinblades. Furthermore, heavy thrusting swords have a higher motion value for this weapon art, so you're only looking at a very low reduction in damage compared to the Greatsword. The sword lance is a much friendlier option for level 150 because we already need a ton of endurance for our armor set. Any of the Crucible armor pieces will buff this weapon art's damage by 4% per piece, which amounts to roughly 17% total, thanks to calculation being multiplicative. You do have a tiny bit lower poise damage compared to the Greatsword though, but 5.5 base poise damage on the sword lance is still higher than most other weapon types available on this weapon art. Okay, that's enough negatives about the Twinblade Crucible wings. Let's see if there are any redeeming qualities. The first thought that must come to people's mind is probably the status effect application, since the Twinblade version is associated with multi-hit. While you can do a total of 320% status damage with this skill, you once again should only expect roughly 240% from 6 hits. And while 240% is higher than the normal version's 100%, it isn't much at all considering the lengthy cast time. In fact, even if you assumed a consistent 320% status damage, the status application of this weapon art will still be crap because the biggest issue is that you can't even status infuse this weapon art, so you have to get status from a grease. Getting your status from a grease is actually worse than Blood Flame Blade, but no infusible twin blades have base bleed, so even the Blood Flame Blade doesn't pair super well with this weapon art. The real secret to this weapon art is that it has a 100% weapon buff multiplier to every single hit, making it much more effective for using damage-based weapon buffs like the ones you get from Intelligence or Faith. And guess what? There is a newly introduced Twinblade with base Faith scaling, the Black Steel Twinblade. Since we want to be able to buff the weapon, I'll be putting it on Heavy Infusion. And the buff we're going with is the Order's Blade, as we don't want to be introducing a third element to our damage type. It also gives us more of a damage buff, which works better with high weapon buff MV. To achieve the highest attack with this Twinblade on Heavy Infusion while using Order's Blade, you actually want a hybrid stat distribution, especially if you're going to be two-handing. I'm going to use 50 Strength and 50 Faith here for clean numbers, which is only 2 more points than 18 Strength and 80 Faith. With this stat distribution, the Clawmark Seal has the highest incantation power, but incantation buffs only use pure Faith scaling, so the Dryleaf Seal is actually your best seal. This allows you to achieve 12% higher attack than Sacred Infusion. This hybrid stat distribution is useful for pure raw damage for your base moveset. However, this is not what we're going to do. Because of the 100% weapon buff motion value for the Crucible wings, we are going for pure Faith investment to maximize our Sacred Seal's Faith buff with backloaded seals like the Erdtree. This only puts our attack at 6% higher over the Sacred Infusion, or 5% lower than the hybrid option. But this stat distribution is going to be doing much more than a measly 6% over the Sacred, and even higher damage than our hybrid option. By loading our attack into Order's Blade, we maximize our damage through the weapon buff portion, which will deal its full 100% damage per hit. Furthermore, you retain a full Faith investment instead of a Strength Faith hybrid, meaning that your other incantations are going to be more powerful as well. This way, you can get damage similar to that of Heavy Sword Lance plus Spear Talisman on counter hits. Except, I haven't added the multi-hit talismans yet to further buff your weapon art's damage. This is the talisman setup I'm running to fully buff this weapon art. The two-handed sword talisman does not work with the weapon art, even though it is better when using the normal moveset. Utilizing the buff MV is, I think, probably the best way to use the Crucible wings with Twinblades. As a Faith build, you can also mix other aspects of the Crucible incantations, which do get the same bonus as the weapon art from your armor. I myself am not too big of a fan of these though, even with a 17% damage boost while using the Erdtree seal at the best possible stat distribution already. They're just not too outstanding. I prefer using more generic options to cover my other elemental damage types. But if you want the full cosplay, go for it. For the Twinblade version of this build, this is the stat distribution taking into account for what we need. It is quite stat heavy since we need to invest into intelligence for Order's Blade 2. However, 16 Mind is a bit too low for my taste. The weapon art and Order's Blade both cost 22 FP to cast, so this weapon art is on the more expensive side. I'd much rather drop 4 points in faith for 4 more mind, even if it means a bit less damage. Some people might be tempted to drop vigor, but as I've said, the Twinblade version of Crucible Wings is fairly lengthy in its animation time. It is very easy to get hit here and there. I'm not stopping you from dropping vigor, but I'm making sure you know the risks. If you're going for level 200, you can fill up your stats while investing the rest into strength for more damage, since you are using a heavy Twinblade. Because of how much stat this build requires, it does scale well to higher levels. For the Twinblade build's crystal tiers, I suggest the Opaline Heart tier and the Holy Shrouding Crack tier, just for more tankiness and damage. Since I've discussed using the regular version of the weapon art as well, I might as well cover the optimized stat distribution for using the Sword Lance. This option is much more forgiving on the stat distribution, and you have more FP to spam too. The required stat distribution can be achieved through more than one class, and you can just toss the extra points to mind on hero. Of course, if you don't mind buffing, drop strength to get 25 faith for Golden Vow and Flame grants me strength. And if you're going for higher levels on this build, you can swap to the Greatsword with more endurance investment for that tiny bit of extra damage and poise damage, and definitely get 25 faith at this point. As for the talismans, you would want to use the Spear Talisman for counter hits instead of the multi-hit talismans. And the final talisman is a flex slot, but Crimson Seed always works great. For the Sword Lance or Greatsword build's crystal tier, I suggest the Opaline Heart tier and the Deflecting Heart tier because both the Sword Lance and Greatsword are good with Deflecting Heart tier as well. This way, you don't only just spam weapon arts. Both versions of the build are fun and good in their own right, so give the one you prefer a try. Like and subscribe for more detailed breakdowns like this one. If you want to support my work, please consider buying my fantasy novel or donating to my Patreon down below. With a book purchase, you can also request a topic from me. Krite, signing out.